Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gloria Blackwell, Chief Executive Officer at the American Association of University Women. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar with Dr. Patricia BellScott. So let's get started. I'm incredibly excited and pleased to introduce AAUW American Fellowship's alumna, Dr. Patricia BellScott. She's an award-winning author and professor emerita of women's studies and human development and family science at the University of Georgia. She's been researching and writing about the Reverend Dr. Paulie Murray for more than 3 decades. The catalyst for her best-selling biography, The Firebrand and the First Lady, was a letter she received from Murray. That book, which tells the story of Murray's decades-long friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, has garnered many awards and recognition, including the Lillian Smith Book Award, Best Adult Nonfiction Book of the Year by the American Library Association, finalist for the Andrew Carnegie Award for Excellence in Nonfiction, and nominee for the National Book Award. Her previous books include Life Notes, Personal Writings by Contemporary Black Women, which was a featured selection of the Quality Paperback Book Club and the Black Literary Guild. Flat-Footed Truths, Telling Black Women's Lives, and Double Stitch, Black Women Write About Mothers and Daughters, which won the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize. Nearly 40 years after its publication, the textbook All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, a landmark in Black women's studies that she co-edited with another AAUW Fellowship alumna, Barbara Smith, and Akasha Hull, was named in 2020 to both the New York Public Library Essential Reads on Feminism list and the Schomburg Research Center's Black Liberation Reading List. Dr. BellScott served for a decade as co-founding editor of SAGE, a scholarly journal on Black women, and is a former contributing editor to Ms. Magazine and co-founder of the National Women's Studies Association, for which she served as co-convener of the inaugural Coordinating Council. She has held postdoctoral fellowships at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard, as well as the Jane and Harry Wilson Center for the Humanities Arts at the University of Georgia. She's also held professorial research and administrative appointments at the University of Connecticut, Wellesley Center for Research on Women, MIT, and her alma mater, the University of Tennessee. A distinguished teacher, she's also a co-founder of the University of Georgia Teaching Academy. Dr. BellScott has been a collaborator on several film projects, one of which we'll talk about today. She appeared as an on-screen commentator in the CNN First Ladies docuseries episode on Eleanor Roosevelt. She's an associate producer and on-screen commentator for the documentary Lillian Smith, Breaking the Silence, and serves as consulting producer for the newly released documentary My Name is Paulie Murray, which examines the life of Paulie Murray, a non-binary Black lawyer, activist, writer, and priest who influenced both Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia BellScott.
Thank you so much. First, before we begin, I want to say how proud I am at this particular moment to have as our executive director, Gloria J. Blackwell. I am just so excited about having you as leader at this moment, as we celebrate the 140th anniversary of the association.
Thank you so much.
I also want to thank Mylon Anderson for making the preparations for this seminar, and she has made it such a delight for someone who is technically challenged.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate that. I'm very excited to be taking the reins of AAUW on this momentous year of celebrating 140 years, and I'm really excited about the opportunity and potential that lies ahead. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So let's jump right in. So you were an undergrad in the late '60s and early '70s, which coincided with the second wave feminism. So how aware of that period of time? How aware were you of what was happening at that time?
I stepped on the campus at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, in the fall of 1968, 5 months after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The summer in urban centers was rife with racial violence. Shortly after Dr. King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War was in a very critical stage. Um, and so when I stepped on that campus, my mission was, because this was also a time at the university where they had just admitted what they perceived to be what they perceived to be um, their major thrust towards serious desegregation. I think there were like 100 Black students on a college campus, a predominantly white college campus of approximately 25,000. And so I saw it as my mission to strive for excellence, to prove that I belonged. But I also saw my mission as a representation of the race. I am, for our viewers, old enough to be part of that generation, which perceived myself as always representing the race, and that it was really important to do my very best. So in 1968, at the beginning of my graduate career, the notion of gender equity was not at the front of my consciousness. Shortly uh, after inter- Shortly after my first semester or two, I began to notice some things that I had not paid close attention to previously. Being a child of the South, growing up on the south side of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a segregated community, I had had the experience of um, growing up with parents who were working class, who did not have the opportunity for a higher education, who did not have the opportunity to prepare for employment in the corporate or middle or upper class settings. So they could not really prepare me for what I was to experience. Also, I did not notice a lot of differentiation between how males and females were treated when I was in high school. But what I noticed on campus uh, was that certainly by the time I was in the second year of college, that I had no women professors who were part of the tenure track faculty ranks. I began to notice, because I was a student who also loved science, and I was taking microbiology and organic chemistry. And I noticed as I moved into the more advanced courses, there were no women or people of color. And I can remember very vividly walking into my microbiology class for the very first time and hearing, I could have heard a pin drop, because people were surprised that I was walking in. And I do remember that someone said rather softly, "This is a microbiology class." And I looked around and I noticed no women, no people of color. And I just smiled and I said, "I know." And I took my seat. The assumption was that uh, women don't take these kinds of classes, and certainly not people of color. So I began to notice some things about the expectation in terms of women students. I also noticed that as I went along in my undergraduate career and I became very active in the Black Students Association, that and I was also, I assumed some leadership roles. I've noticed over time that there was some resentment coming toward women Black women students who had served the association very ably. And um, at the time, there were various student activists coming to campus, many of them males who were not sympathetic toward women's issues. And I felt, first of all, stunned by it, but then increasingly impatient with it. So much so that by the time I got to graduate school on that campus, I was actively engaged in raising questions about women's issues in the curriculum and knew that I very much wanted to incorporate that kind of content into the work that I was to do and into the teaching. So I, in some ways, not parallel, mirrored what Paulie Murray describes in her memoir, Sung in a Weary Throat, having grown up in a supportive environment with the notion that as long as I applied myself, that I could do whatever I wanted to do, found myself in a situation where there were people who thought that my opportunities should be restricted because of my sex. And she described going to law school, committed to being a civil rights activist, an attorney, but leaving an unabashed feminist as well.
Yeah, very interesting parallel journeys. And I'm sure that many of our participants can relate to your experience of feeling as though you were told that the world is your oyster, and then when you got out there, it turned out that there were people who oftentimes it seemed like their main goal to hold you back and to keep you from succeeding. So that's a little bit about your undergrad years. So you were awarded an American Fellowship from AAUW in 1984. Talk a bit about how that award impacted your sort of early research and your studies at that time when you were in graduate school.
That award came at a critical moment because at the time, I was not sure whether or not I wanted to stay inside the academy, and if I did stay inside the academy, which side of the academy I would stay in. By that, I mean whether or not I would take the administrative route or whether or not I would stay with the professoriate. What I did know was that I really liked gathering data, and whether it was social science data or whether it was historical records, I knew that I loved gathering data and applying it to questions that had to do with issues of equity. And so at the time I decided to make this application to the AAUW, I was actually working in the office of the president at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I was good at administration, but I recognized fairly soon that the aspects of that job, which I really loved, were those assignments where I was given a policy question and asked to find out if we had data on the campus or if data could be gathered, which could be applied to that question. And I was the person who was given questions that had to do with racial and gender equity issues. And I noticed how enriching and personally energizing that was for me, much more energizing than managing committee meetings. And so I applied for this fellowship so that I could spend some time interviewing Black women leaders, looking at Black women's educational history, to think more seriously about what some of the barriers and obstacles were and how I might be helpful in addressing that. So it was a critical period. And after that fellowship, I never looked back. There would be opportunities time and time again to become an administrator or to do something else. But I just found teaching, research, and writing tremendously satisfying, and I never turned back.
That's great how that opportunity ended up showing you what you really loved.
Yes.
And so I mentioned earlier that AAW, we are celebrating our 140th anniversary. Uh, can you talk a bit about how AAUW really impacted your career when you just mentioned that you never looked back at the admin track because you had found the space that clearly suited your needs and really met your desire to work with data and to work in a research fashion.
I feel that AAUW has impacted me in ways that I continue to learn about. For example, when I began writing this book, The Firebrand and the First Lady, I was surprised to discover links, or I would say, if I was doing an organizational chart, dotted lines between um, that connect the women in this book and eventually connect to me. For example, I think of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an early AAUW member and leader. I think of Sarah Hughes, who was a AAU leader and also a former president. These two women were among a handful of people who supported Paulie Murray's application to Harvard Law School after she was denied admission. And their support was truly critical because even though Paulie's professors at Howard University were all, many of whom were graduates of Harvard Law School, they were not about to buck the administration and support her in an appeal. But um, but Hughes and Roosevelt offered kind notes and gestures and said that they would help in whichever way they could. Eleanor Roosevelt nudged her husband. She bugged FDR until he finally wrote, I really think it was kind of a half-hearted note to the president of Harvard asking him, hey, can you look into this? And Sarah Hughes, who was on, I think, the board of the college, also said that, promised Paulie that she would look into it. And I think the fact that Paulie was so appreciative and took in how helpful it can be in times when one is feeling low and disappointed about an opportunity that you so rightfully deserve, never forgot that kind of gesture, such that she continued to do that kind of thing with me and with others. I can't tell you the number of um, women, Black women and women, women generally, who have said to me after they've read the book, you know, I got a letter from her when I made the dean's list. So when she heard about, and these are people she never met, she didn't know. And at the time that she wrote the first letter to me, I didn't even know that Paulie Murray knew anything about me. But what she did, I want to share with you the one gesture that was really important to me, and that is when in the early 1980s, when women's studies curricula were being developed across the country, and Newsweek magazine decided that that they would do a feature on women's studies in the U.S. In that feature, they focused only on women's studies professors and curricula in historically white and mostly research institutions. There was no mention made of any professors or curricula, what was happening in historically Black college or any work by women of color. And by this time, our textbook had come out. It was award winning. And we, of course, were disappointed and frustrated by this. And we sent our little protest letter to Newsweek, in which we said, the next time you do a feature on women's studies, please include all the women. And uh, Paulie Murray read our protest letter and sent us a letter in which she said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have that quote in front of me directly, but something to the effect that if Newsweek doesn't get the point, here's an old timer who does. She said, keep at it. What you're trying to do can be done. I mean, and that was such an uplifting thing, missive communication for us to receive from someone who carried so much weight in our life.
That's really beautiful, and it's a perfect example of how people, you don't know the kind of impact that you can have on someone, and how when you mention the linkages between AAUW and you start connecting the dots, it's one of the things that we have become fully aware of here at AAUW, just how many of the women are connected because of the way in which AAUW's fellowship program, gave them that boost that they needed, and they in turn, really modeled behavior by lifting at, making sure that they were, lifting as they climbed, and I think that's really critical when we talk about women supporting and helping to elevate other women. Paulie Murray was really in the full swing of their career while you were still an undergraduate. So, what was that moment when you became aware of Paulie Murray?
I encountered Paulie Murray as a writer. I first learned about Paulie Murray through her family memoir, Proud Shoes. And this this book came to me because I was in the process of developing a course on African American families, and then later I developed a course on African American women. And I have always been drawn toward women's narratives. And so as I was looking around to for narratives of family and women's lives that touched upon at early period, I discovered this text and found it tremendously frustrating that it was out of print intermittently. So that every time I planned to teach it, I was always trying to scrounge up copies um, uh, from bookstores, where they might happen to have out of print copies. So I was first introduced to her through her writing, and then I as I began to develop as a scholar and an activist in my work in women's studies, as I said, she reached out to me um, in the letters that Paulie wrote to me. She presented as female, and so when I was introduced to her, when she introduced herself to me, um, I was introduced to her as a female. We now, looking back at her documents, identify her as non-binary, but all of Paulie's life, she presented as female. So that in those days, I looked at her as a critical forerunner in the field of women's studies, and the efforts that she made to reach out to me and my colleagues was through our writing. And so it was in that sense that I began to see Paulie um, as a writer who was huge. It's much later that I began to learn about Paulie Murray, the lawyer and the activist, and then the priest. By the time Paulie reaches out to me, she's an ordained priest.
And so these interactions and engagements obviously, influence you. So the motivation to write about Paulie Murray and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, somewhere along the way that emerged. So first of all, it's kind of what motivated you to write about that connection. And I know that you worked on the project for a number of years. And how did it change over the years that you worked on it?
Okay. Um, a number of years equals 20 plus. And I'm still going in my work on Paulie. Um, just as Paulie reached out to Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt with a protest letter where she uh, called them out, she reached out to me with sort of a hot letter, and in that letter, she was gently encouraging me in the work that I was doing because was involved in the founding of a journal on Black women, and so it was the first scholarly journal of that period on Black women, and I had invited her to participate to write an article, and she said, "No, no, 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 no. I don't have time to do that. But in the meantime," she wrote, "You need to know some of the veterans on whose shoulders you stand." And I can remember it was December of 1983, and I can remember feeling, ooh, this woman is pointing her finger at me and she is telling me, you've got work to do, you've got people you need to learn about. And among those persons she mentions, first of all, is Eleanor Roosevelt. And so I'm thinking, that's interesting. And she also says at the same time that she's telling me I won't be able to contribute to the journal, she said, but this is a really important project. And essentially she says, don't bother me for another 12 months or so because I've got to finish. And these were the words she used, dreaded autobiography. I've got to finish this dreaded autobiography. I had no idea that that autobiography was Sung in a Weary Throat. I also did not know that in 18 months she would be dead, from pancreatic cancer. So the fact that she even took the time, she was taking the time to write to me and my colleagues when she was pushing, as viewers probably know if you've seen the film My Name is Paulie Murray. um, she was pushing, working very hard to get this book done because she had a sense that her days were numbered. So so that was something else that really stayed with me. And because she mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, that stayed with me. And I thought Eleanor Roosevelt, what I had learned about her previously, was an interesting person, but I didn't get fired up about that. So that when Paulie died in 1985, it took me maybe 9 years, almost a decade after that, to really think, well, it might be interesting to just see what is there. I by this time, the memoir had been published. It was published posthumously 2 years after her death, and so I thought on a research visit to the Schlesinger Library, where I was actually doing work on something else, and I stood up to take a break and thought, why don't I go and take a look at the first um, file folder of correspondence between Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt. I read the first letter and I just got up, walked to the elevator, got up, left the room, went to the elevator where there was a water fountain, took a sip, and then walked back into the reading room, closed the folder of the material I was working on, and I knew this was what I was supposed to do. So that line in that letter where Paulie Murray said to me, you need to get to know the names of the veterans on whose shoulders you now stand, was something that hooked me. And then, I would say 4 years after I had started the work, I felt I trembled when I came across a line in a letter she written to Caroline Ware, a close friend of Paulie Murray's, in which Paulie said, I am making notes for my future biographer. Um, and there was nobody designated. She said, but um, my thought is that that person may start, that biography might begin with my friendship with Mrs. R. And then I thought, oh my. And then I began to wonder, maybe this wasn't a coincidence that within 18 months of her passing, she writes me two letters, encouraging letters, but one very pointedly telling me you need to get to know. So it reminds me of something shared by two of her students in the film, who said, two of the men who were students of Paulie Murray's at Brandeis, when they said, you know, she had that look on her face and she would say, you need to get to know something. Uh, so after I read that, I thought, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I never stopped.
So it was a 20-year journey of love.
It has been. It has
And
been.
absolutely. Talk a bit about the relationship between Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt, and how do you think each of them influenced the other's views?
This is a very interesting relationship. Talk about two unlikely people. Here you have Paulie Murray, whose ancestry includes um, enslaved people, uh, a freed people, a white woman who leaves her family to marry a Black man, a woman of Cherokee ancestry. And Polly claims all this as her. She claims it all. And then here you have Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the niece of a US president, who marries a president, and whose ancestry entitles her to membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then so you have this tremendous difference in social class, uh, but what's also very clear is they have a lot of common, a lot in common. They are both shy, innately shy. They are voracious readers. They were both orphaned as children, and I think this is particularly important for both of them. They grew up under the tutelage. They are raised by elderly kin. They both love dogs. They they are both can be both temperamental. They both suffer from low spirits at times. Uh, they're both independent thinkers, curious, so that in many ways they share a lot in common. They're both socially ridiculed for their appearance. So they know that sense of being an outsider. And so what seems on the surface like an unlikely friendship turns out to be one in which two people find common ground and common interest, but though it doesn't start out that way, because um, Polly is this impatient, um, independent, determined uh, woman, presenting as a woman who uh, is determined to challenge authority head on, even if it's the president and the first lady. She she is confrontive. She talks about how the friendship begins as a confrontation by typewriter. She no holds barred, and she's honest. She's brutally honest. Um, and Eleanor, who is has had friendships with Black people before, but they tend to be people who are age mates, like Mary McLeod Bethune, and they are institutional leaders. So they deal with the Roosevelts very differently. And so Paulie is this person to whom Eleanor can turn to for a very frank, honest, brash, and sometimes Eleanor say it to her, very impolitic response. And so they clash at first. And then there are cases that come up over the course of their friendship, like the Odell Waller case, which involves a Black sharecropper convicted by an all white jury of shooting his landlord, in which the two of them work together to try to win a new trial for him. They are unsuccessful, but the effort brings them closer together. And then by the time that FDR dies and Eleanor leaves the White House, they have reached a new point in the friendship, so that it's not confrontive as it was at the beginning. They've gone beyond allyship, and they are truly friends. They have mutual respect, honesty. They show caring. They recognize birthdays, illnesses. Eleanor comes to visit Paulie when she's in the hospital. So this becomes a genuine friendship that they sustain through letters and periodic visits.
Yeah, and in reading the book that I read the book a number of years ago when you participated in our AAUW book club. The thing that I really uh, loved was just the the authenticity of Paulie Murray, and how Paulie was going to be Paulie no matter who was on the receiving end, and that on this authenticity really came through, and the development of what was truly a genuine friendship, that lasted for such a long time, and the way that you took all of the research and pulled it together in such a way was is very fascinating. And so I hope that those of you who are participating on the call who've not yet read The Firebrand and the First Lady, that you will take the opportunity to do so, because it will be well worth the read. And one of the things that you talk about is the feeling that Paulie Murray had been marginalized by history until recently. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, I think there are several reasons. I would think the perhaps the primary reason has to do with the fact that was um, she was she was non-binary. She she was non-binary identity, though it was perceived in that historical context, she was perceived as lesbian, um, and spoken of, whispered about as lesbian. And some of her friends I interviewed described her as lesbian. And she was also just had such an independent streak and impatience um, with hierarchical institutions. And so what we've learned, and why doing this book was important to me, is that who stays and who writes the history um, tends to make a difference in terms of how um, one is remembered. Before this book, I mean, I'm so delighted now that when people hear about Eleanor Roosevelt's human rights work and her civil rights work, many people now know about Paulie, but many people have done, there are lots of biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt and biographies of Franklin Roosevelt, but and these documents have always been there, but somehow or another scholars have not seen this relationship as important. So women tend to be marginalized. People who are genderqueer tend to be marginalized. Polly was independent. She was impatient. She was, the other thing is she was brilliant. She was so much smarter than a lot of people. So that meant that if she couldn't get movement in a particular institution or on some issue, she would step over it and keep moving. And what we now know, and what delights me about the film, is that her contributions now are being recognized, because of course people were quite happy to take her ideas and use them without attribution. So that now we have some understanding of Paulie's contribution to the Brown decision. We have some understanding of Paulie's contribution to the work on that the ACLU eventually began to do under the leadership of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on issues of equity. And that's what makes, that's one of the things that endeared Justice Ginsburg to me, is that unlike many others who used Paulie's work as foundational, but did not credit her, Justice Ginsburg did do that. And that's really important, and something I hope that we as AAUW members will remember in our own work. I'm sure probably everybody in this seminar today has had the experience of having your ideas appropriated or used in some way without your being credited.
That's a really great point, because Paulie Murray is the definition of a firebrand. So we know where the title of the book came from, and the challenge also of Black women being credited for their work, is one that's ongoing. All you have to do is look at the hashtag, cite Black women, and you see on so many occasions how work is being appropriated. And I think that people standing up for other women and also, calling it out is important as well. Let's move a bit to the film. Talk a bit about your role as consulting producer for the new film. My Name is Paulie Murray.
Uh, that has been one of the most exciting opportunities since the book came out. I saw my role as consulting producer as one of offering whatever assistance was asked of me, which included, identifying possible themes, identifying possible interviewees. I had met in this 20 years of research and interviewed many of Paulie's long-term friends. I so regret that essentially all of those people have passed on. The last one to die was Eileen Hernandez, who was the first woman of color to be president of NOW. She succeeded Betty Friedan. So one of the things that I did is I worked to identify interviewees, and I also suggested sites. And in the film, you see a couple of times, or maybe 3 times, the Paulie Murray home place, which is now the site of the Paulie Murray Center for History and Social Justice. And it's very special to be on the grounds there. Every time I've been on the grounds, I've always felt Paulie's presence. So that has been really exciting to me. And I also saw participation in this film as a way to respond or give back to a new generation of young people, many of whom have said to me when I have done readings or they've learned things about Paulie that, I'm hurt, I'm upset, I really want to know more. How can I learn more? And this film, because it is being streamed, is one that can be accessed by people around the world. I mean, there's no way possible that I or other Paulie Murray scholars could reach all the people who are hungry to know more. So this is a way of telling this story and continuing Paulie's legacy. She had such a generous spirit of giving that back.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think that when people when people view the film, they will be able to see for themselves just the incredible contributions that Paulie Murray made. So, in your estimation, given all of the research that you had the privilege of being able to do, what do you think will be Paulie Murray's lasting contribution to the movement for human rights and equality?
I think the notion that human rights are indivisible, and she said that long time ago. I mean, we hear women's rights are human rights and children's rights are human rights and BTQ plus rights are human rights. Paulie's argument was that human rights are indivisible. And that was the driving force behind her scholarship. That was the driving force behind her writing. This writing that she did, which came out of a sense of compassion, so that this sense that we are all connected. And by the time she probably became a priest, she in her sermons would talk about seeing herself as a person who embraced all ethnicities, uh, that she was neither male nor female, neither black nor white, nor any other ethnicity. Because she grew up with a grandfather who lost his vision fighting for the Union Army. She had a tremendous concern for those who had disabilities. She was concerned as she grew older. She began to talk about uh, the treatment of people as we age. I mean, so this whole sense of the rights of an individual, I think, are just that's a major contribution.
That's great. So, when people have the opportunity to see the film, I'm sure many of our participants already have seen it. What would be sort of the lasting message that you would like for them to take away from My Name is Paulie Murray?
Well, I have two. I have two quotes I'd like to share. The first quote is from Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor said, "Staying aloof is not a solution, it's cowardly evasion." And then Paulie Murray said, this one really grabs my soul. She says, "Our actions have a lasting significance and consequences that are felt throughout eternity. Therefore, we need not despair because we seem to fail or cannot see the fruition of our efforts on behalf of others. If we build with love and compassion, we can build with hope." Paulie Murray.
Beautiful. So, I think that there are so many lessons that we can learn through learning more about the life of Paulie Murray and, of course, her relationships, not just with Eleanor Roosevelt, but with other scholars and judges and politicians, and, really coming into their own self, later in life through becoming a priest as well. Because, human rights are indivisible is such a powerful statement, and acknowledging sort of the many ways in which all of the different parts of them intersected to make them who they ultimately were. It's very, very powerful. So we have you mentioned access to the film, which is great because then you don't have to, be zoomed to a million people or try to hop on a plane and go and visit all these people. So there are a couple of questions about how can people begin to think about introducing the film in women and gender studies courses or programmings? Like, what might be approach to making that happen?
I think I think that it would be very helpful to use, in addition to in terms of preparing students for this. I would think it would be very helpful to read Paulie's memoir, Song in a Weary Throat. so that because there's only so much we could do in the film. And I say this all the time. Paulie Murray is huge. And so to have students, and she was a person who saw who placed life, her life, others' lives in historical context. And she does this in this memoir. So if you're teaching a women's studies course, I think it would be really helpful to use, have students read Sung in a Weary Throat first. There is also a wonderful oral uh, interview of Paulie Murray. That's online. It's through the University of North Carolina Oral History Project. Anybody can just go to that site and you can hear her voice and you can hear her talking. And it's important when we think about listening to narratives to be able to hear the nuances. And so in this interview, you can hear her laugh. You can hear the anxiety. You can hear when she's frustrated. And so for there, I find sometimes that people really want to get a sense of what the temperature was like around her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that would be, I would start with the personal narratives
That's
first.
good. That's really good. A question that popped up was about, we've been saying my name is Paulie Murray. That is the name of the film, and it is being streamed on Amazon Prime for those who would like to access the film, and we certainly recommend that. Another question is about the interesting question around relationships between Black and white women. Thanking you for the work that you've done, Dr. BellScott, and the work that you will continue to do. The question says, why are friendships between Black and white women still so fraught?
Okay, first, my first response is it's my experience as a scholar interested in women's friendships generally, is that friendships are difficult, period.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we add the layer of race to it, what we find is that it requires tremendous work. Friendships, like any relationship, requires tremendous work. And one of the things that enabled Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt to endure was their commitment to each other and their willingness to be brutally honest, to be totally honest. And sometimes they'd have to back away for a moment to gather themselves and process it, but then they would come back. And so to make the commitment to stay in the relationship, and when you are truly upset about something, as opposed to initially focusing on the other person, to turn inward, to look at, okay, why am I upset? What's happening with me? Um, so that we're talking about serious, deep work on one's person, and that you have to do that first in order to be in this relationship and make it work. Because
Mm-hmm.
my experience is that women's relationships, because we meaning women, tend to go deeper in our relationships than men, are always tricky and can often be fragile. And then when you add race, and sometimes this person asked the question about race, it could be class, it could be regional.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I had challenges leaving the South and going to New England and finding the expectations about who I would be and who I
Mm-hmm.
am somewhat problematic. So learning to be honest with yourself and learning to sit with, this is something else, learning to sit with the discomfort before you try to analyze what's going on. Sit with the discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Very good advice in the times that we're in and the conversations that so many of us are having around race and class that, people are often unwilling to sit with that discomfort. We want everything to be perfect and tied up in a nice little bow, but these conversations are difficult conversations, and having them, I think, is in examining your own motives for having them, and your own role in
Hmm.
conversations around, assuming something will be difficult when in the end it may not be as difficult as you think it is. But it really is about self-examination and examining your own motives. So I appreciate that perspective.
And recognizing where your power is, and are you using it in a way that it has integrity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Question around mentoring. What are your thoughts on mentoring for mature graduate students?
Mature graduate.
I think you can just
I'm not sure.
yeah,
I'm not
take
sure.
the question at face value.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think
Um,
it's meant graduate students who may not be at perhaps a younger age, maybe someone who
oh, oh,
returned to graduate
oh,
school at later in
oh,
life, that sort of
okay.
thing.
Well, what I found in my last few years of being a professor is I found mature graduate students to be a delight. I found it to be a delight because there are generational issues that at that time I felt like I shared with them. I sometimes found um, graduate students who had had very little experience outside of the academy, um, somewhat difficult and for me to work with. And also there are other generational differences because um, dear viewers, I'm 70 years old. So working sometimes with a 20 or 30-year old, I come with my own cultural baggage and I put that on the table so that I have expectations and they have expectations. And sometimes it didn't work out.
It's a it's a perfect way to end the conversation. I think that we all look at our relationships that play a key part in our lives, throughout our lives and throughout our careers. And the relationship between Paulie Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt was a very powerful relationship. And the film, My Name is Paulie Murray, will give us some insight, into someone that so many people don't know anything about, and the impact that she had on, so many people that we knew so much more about. And I
Mhm.
really appreciate the way that you brought the story and her life to us through your book and through your consulting on the film to really open everyone's eyes to someone who had such an impact on women's history, women's rights, and human rights. So I want to thank you so much, Pat, for sharing your insight and your knowledge with us, and definitely your time with us, because I know that time is precious. Everyone, if you want more information about what Dr. BellScott is working on, you can visit her website, patriciabellscott.com, where you can, read up on some of the other materials that she is working on and the books that she has published. You can also, you'll be able to review this webinar, as I mentioned at the top of the program, because it will be available on the AAUW website. I also want to thank Milan on our AAUW team for her support tonight. And I encourage everyone to visit our website at aauw.org to learn more about professional development courses and training that we'll be having coming up, and many of the educational programs that we offer through the AAUW Equity Network and through our Empower program. We will be asking for your thoughts on what you might be interested in and learning more about, and we definitely want you to share your thoughts and your thoughts about the program and the information that Dr. BellScott brought to us this afternoon. And always, we encourage you to contribute to AAUW so that we can continue to provide these really valuable and interesting and thought-provoking programs. I would like to ask Dr. BellScott to give us the last word, and I really thank you all for being with us.
Well, this last word comes not specifically from Paulie Murray's text, but something I learned from of studying her life, and that is um, that self care is really important. And as we go forward today in our work as educators, scholars, and activists, um, it's really important that we practice self care. And there weren't that many people around to give Paulie help in caring self care. And I just, and I've had to learn it myself. Self care is really, really important. So I want to leave all the viewers with that.
Thank you so much. Those are beautiful words to end on. Thank you, everyone. Please wear a mask and stay safe. We appreciate your participation this evening. Thank you so much, Pat.
All
Have a
right.
great evening.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.